Hi everybody, today we're going to be looking at a poem called Punishment by the Irish writer Seamus Heaney. Now, before we get started, I really need to remind myself not to get carried away because Irish poetry was the area that I researched extensively when I was doing my PhD, so I will try to rein it in a little bit. But I am incredibly enthusiastic about this area of study. So before we get into Seamus Heaney's poetry, I'm just going to remind you that we're using literary theory as a way of thinking about a lot of the text on this playlist. And literary theory is never something that should be ever used as a checklist or as a straitjacket. You know, you shouldn't say, right, I'm going to take a postcolonial approach, which therefore means I need to look at this, 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 and this. I'm going to map that directly onto the literature that I'm looking at. That's a really reductive approach and it doesn't illuminate the text at all. That's focusing on the theory. And what we want to do is be led by the text, because if you're here to study English literature or world literature, then you're going to have to use the theory to illuminate the text and have the text at the centre of everything that you're interested in. So loosely, we're going to be informed by postcolonial theory for today's session. And if you're not sure what that is, have a look at my other videos on my literary theory playlist and then come back to this video. So Seamus Heaney, if you're not familiar with him, he is one of the most famous poets in the world, was born in 1939, just at the start of the Second World War, and he died in 2013. He was raised in County Derry in Northern Ireland. He studied at Queen's University, Belfast. He became a teacher. And in the mid-1960s, he found himself gaining a reputation as a poet. And he was associated with a revival in the creative arts in Northern Ireland. And if you are interested in contemporary poetry or modern poetry, Ireland and Northern Ireland are really the places to look at. Belfast and Dublin are the centre of an enormous amount of creative energy, and I'll signal some of the poets that are involved in that to you at the end of this video. Heaney later moved to the Republic of Ireland. He's also lectured extensively in the USA, and he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995. And there's so much information out there online if you're interested in looking at Heaney. There's loads of essays, lots of his poems are available and so on. So I really do encourage you to have a look at Heaney because he is an incredible writer. And before we look at today's poem, I just also want to say that as a kind of modern giant of poetry, his work is incredibly wide-ranging as well. So what we're going to look at is quite a politically engaged poem. It's from a very particular point in history and a very particular point in Seamus Heaney's career. And although Heaney's style is very distinctive, his concerns at different times of his life were quite different. So if you look at his early poetry, for example, Death of a Naturalist, which was his first collection, it's about a child coming into awareness of the world around him. So the rural setting that he lived in, also the political world that he lived in. Then when we get on to the section that we're going to look at today, which is a collection called North, Heaney was very politically engaged. The political situation in Northern Ireland was at a critical point. There was a lot of violence, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so that poetry is, as I've said, of a particular historical moment, although it does have universal themes which resonate, which echo out as well. And then if you look at Heaney's later poetry, there's a sense of opening up and becoming less interested in the specific events in Ireland and Northern Ireland and more interested in these universal themes, although that kind of Irish idea still echoes through that. So if you don't like today's poem, don't think that means you don't like Seamus Heaney, because there's so much to his work. And if your knowledge of Heaney as well is about digging potatoes, then again, there is so much more to him than that. Digging Potatoes, which is a poem or a trope in his poetry that you might be very familiar with from school, is not necessarily all there is to Heaney. Looking at Punishment then, we need to know a little bit about the background of Ireland and Northern Ireland and the history there in order to understand what's going on in the poem. So And this is going to be our kind of post-colonial element here. And post-colonialism is possible for Northern Irish and Irish poetry because Ireland was settled by the English for many centuries, and then it was absorbed into the United Kingdom. When Heaney was born in 1939, the island had been partitioned into two sections for 18 years. So we've got the 6 counties of Northern Ireland to the north of the border, and then we've got the counties which are now known as the Republic of Ireland. So the Republic of Ireland is now a separate country. North is still part of the UK. And when Heaney was starting to become famous in the 1960s, the civil rights movement in the USA was really gaining a voice on the world stage. And we'll know from the Black Lives Matter movement at the minute how important that was. At the same time, this inspires civil rights marches in Northern Ireland, which demanded equality for Protestants and Catholics. So a lot of the tension in Ireland has been between Protestants who are normally associated with the English and with the Unionist political group who want to maintain that connection to England, and Catholics who are usually associated with the Republic of Ireland and with nationalists who want to have their own nation to be separate from the UK. Now, that is not a clear-cut division in any way, but if you're going to stereotype, that's the kind of general picture that we've got. And north of the border, in Northern Ireland, Catholics were often disenfranchised in different ways, and they had less access to good housing, to good education, and so on. So in the civil rights marches in the 1960s, what they were looking for was equality with the Protestant population. Then in the summer of 1969, the Troubles began. Now, this is an extremely complex period of history in Northern Ireland and Ireland, but essentially it's a time of violence where some nationalist Republican groups wanted independence from the United Kingdom, and the Unionist groups wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. So it was a very violent time period. You might have seen on the news at the time, or depending on what age you are, or on TV documentaries or programmes since, that there were a lot of terrorist attacks, the IRA and so on. And this lasted until the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. And obviously there are still ripples and echoes of that in contemporary Northern Irish culture, but I'll just say here that Northern Ireland is a wonderful place to visit, and it's very different from the time period of the Troubles. As we read Heaney's poetry then, with this kind of historical background in mind, there are several post-colonial concerns that therefore echo through his work. And one of these is giving a voice to the voiceless. So Heaney was part of the Catholic community. He was from a Catholic family. He went to a Catholic secondary school. And part of his poetry wants to celebrate that marginalised Catholic culture, which in his early poetry is largely rural, connected with the farming community and so on. We've also then got the idea of brutal violence and atrocities committed during the Troubles. And I suppose the connection to post-colonialism here is that the act of colonising a country then leaves behind it this legacy of violence, of discontent, of separation, of division, of difference. And that's one of the things that Heaney examines, particularly in his early poetry. Yet, as Heaney thinks about violence, his representation of it has led to a considerable amount of controversy, and we'll look at the poem in a second so that you can see what this looks like. So there's a literary critic called Neil Corcoran who's termed this section of Heaney's poetry, this collection called North, as necessary poems. And he says that they give a real insight into violence in Northern Ireland. You know, they reveal to the world what it was like to be caught up in the time of the Troubles. However, there's a poet called Kieran Carson, fabulous poet, and he famously referred to Heaney as the laureate of violence. And Carson was concerned that Heaney's poetry beautified violence, and therefore in showing it as being in some way dignified, Carson was concerned that Heaney was legitimising it. Now, there's quite a lot written about both of these two perspectives, and I think what we need to consider is actually that maybe there's a middle ground here, that Heaney wanted to represent the violence, he wanted to give dignity to the victims of that violence, and so he was walking a very fine line, I suppose, between something that he felt was necessary to articulate and something that he didn't want to legitimise. I mean, how do you represent an event, a horrific atrocity, without giving it some kind of legitimate voice? So it's a really difficult time for Heaney in terms of his writing. And in 1989, Heaney gave a lecture called The Redress of Poetry, in which he kind of hinted at this a little bit. And in this lecture, he says that people who are interested in poetry must consider how poetry's existence as a form of art relates to our existence as citizens of society. So by the form of art, Heaney means that poetry is in itself a beautiful product, like an artwork, and at the same time, as a citizen of society, the poet is compelled to engage with what's going on in the world around him. So, as I said, it's a kind of tightrope that Heaney was walking between genuinely needing to present the violence that was happening at the time, genuinely wanted to give dignity to the victims of that violence, and not legitimising the violence. So the poem itself then, I would suggest at this point, I can't show it on the screen for copyright reasons, so I would suggest that at the moment you Google Punishment by Seamus Heaney, read through it so that you know what I'm talking about, and then come back and watch the next section of the video. Welcome back for doing that. So in Punishment and in the collection North, Heaney parallels bog bodies with contemporary violence in Northern Ireland. And a bog body, I've got a little image on the screen here of one. Bog bodies are from the Iron Age, and they were found in bogs in Scandinavian areas, Northern Europe, and these were bodies that had perhaps been murdered or been ritually sacrificed, and they were preserved perfectly in the anaerobic conditions of the bog. And so some of these bodies have been dug up, they're now on view in museums and so on. And the body referred to in Punishment is thought to be one of these Iron Age bog bodies, which was ritually executed. However, at the same time, Heaney merges this with Northern Irish situations in which people were tarred and feathered, which was a form of punishment for IRA members who were thought to be British sympathisers, or in this poem, for women who consorted with men in the opposite faction. So if a Catholic woman went out with a British soldier, for example, it is possible that she would have been punished, she would have been murdered through being tarred and feathered. So Heaney merges these two experiences to show us how violence has lasted throughout all human history. That yes, the violence in Northern Ireland was horrific at the time, however, it is something that seems to be innate in the human condition, that there is this propensity to evil and to violence. So in terms of the poem, it starts with a very graphic description of the body, and the bog body merges with the body of the Northern Irish girl. Yeah. And then the woman is referred to as a little adulteress. So the indication here is that the modern body that's been tarred and feathered is being punished for dating, going out with, whatever, someone from a different political persuasion, and she's been punished for this in the poem. And then this is the controversial part of the poem. The speaker attempts to restore some of the body's beauty, some of its dignity, and so in doing that, Heaney kind of opened himself up to Kieran Carson's criticism that he is kind of dignifying the act of violence in himself, whereas arguably you could say that Heaney was trying to dignify the body and give it a sense of respect after all of these horrific things had happened to the person. And the speaker of the poem is very self-reflexive about this. He reflects on his own practice, and he describes himself in the poem as an artful voyeur. So someone who's artful, like the Artful Dodger in Dickens, is someone who's quite calculating, maybe a little bit Machiavellian, who's doing something in order to achieve their own ends. At the same time, if you look at that word, there's a pun in there, because art, to be full of art is to be creative, to be a poet, to be an artist. And so Heaney's holding these two ideas in tension. Can an artist, a poet, represent an idea for the public good without looking like he's doing it for his own ends, for his own fame or his own career? And then the idea of the voyeur. So a voyeur is someone, it's from the French word, it's someone who looks on maybe in a situation that they shouldn't kind of be looking at. So someone who's overstepping the line and looking on at the situation. So the speaker is really questioning his own motivations in writing the poem, in presenting these ideas. But at the same time, he feels like he has to present these ideas because the world has to know what's going on. And the speaker also feels caught between two different groups. So he's horrified by the outrage that he's describing, but he's also got a real sense of understanding the intimate revenge that has been taken in the poem. You know, and again, there's this tension in the poem between criticising the violence, but also realising the historical reasons why this violence has taken place. And the poem never resolves this issue. And I think at the time, you know, this issue couldn't actually be resolved for Heaney. But the beauty of Heaney's poetry is that he's not afraid to look at these questions. One of his collections is called Opened Ground, and there's this real sense that Heaney delves into, he opens up ideas, questions, which are quite scary and which are quite difficult, but these questions have to be asked. I'm not going to go through the poem line by line, as I have done in some other videos, but I'm going to ask you some questions about the poem to think about on your own. How does the poet reveal the personal consequences of political unrest? How does he explore, or you should explore, the description of the woman's body, and how does the speaker articulate the pain that she has suffered? How does he present the consequences of violence on the individual? And what motivation is given for this woman's death? And does the speaker understand that? And what is the speaker's attitude to his own role in this situation? Have a look at the use of pronouns in the poem. They're often neglected, however incredibly important. So who's the they in the poem? And how and why does the speaker separate himself from them? Also think about the word dumb in the poem. So the speaker says that those who remain dumb whilst the murders have taken place. And this is one of the reasons, I suppose, why he feels that he has to write the poem, that he can't just stand by while these things are happening and say nothing. And why might there be a sense of complicity with what has taken place? And why is the speaker haunted by a sense of guilt? And then think about this phrase, artful voyeur. What does the speaker mean by it? Does he believe that he is exploiting historical events for his own career, or is there something else going on here? So Punishment is an extremely complex poem, and as I've said, it's wonderful to look at, but it's not necessarily, I don't want you to go away from the poem and think that Seamus Heaney is limited to this particular style. You know, read his other poetry, just Google it, there's lots of poems online, and he is a wonderful, wide-ranging poet as well. There are lots of other Northern Irish poets that you should look at as well if you're interested in this kind of area, and I've just put a picture of some of my bookshelves there, lots of poets represented there, and I haven't managed to put them all on this list, but I've put the main people on this list that you might want to start to look at before you delve a little bit further into this. So we've talked about Heaney. Michael Longley, absolutely fabulous poet, writes a lot of what we call lyric poetry, so it often seems quite personal. His poems are just absolutely beautiful, but also very witty and intelligent, and challenging at the same time. Kieran Carson has a wonderful poem which you might be familiar with called Belfast Confetti. He's slightly younger than Heaney and Longley, just a wonderful poet. Paul Muldoon as well, probably the same generation of Kieran Carson. Derek Mahon is just an incredible poet. He's absolutely wonderful. And again, like Heaney, he's had a very wide-ranging career. He's currently very interested in the environment and ecology and so on, but in the past he has written some very politically engaged poems. If you're thinking that this list is very masculine, then have a look at Evan Boland, who is a female poet and has written some really interesting representations of kind of female experience of these historical events, but also not just limited to the Irish experience, but also looking at the universal ideas of what women are and linking into those feminist ideas. Sinead Morrissey is a younger poet, absolutely fabulous. She's travelled a lot. She's got a wonderful collection about her travels in China and Japan. So I hope that I didn't get carried away in this video too much. I have really just scratched the surface here. There is so much more to look at and to talk about and to think about. So enjoy reading up on some of these poets online and enjoy reading their poetry as well.